All right, welcome to this second episode of Parish and Pub. I am trying to figure out what kind of format I want to do for this channel, and there are so many out there to choose from. There's the long form video essay thing. There's the interview, and then there are the React videos, among many others. And while I'm figuring this out, I thought I'd try my hand at a React video today, only because I found something I think worthy of actually reacting to. So I found an interview of a guy named Derek Thompson, who's recently written an article for The Atlantic, actually a long essay for The Atlantic. And he was interviewed about this essay on a YouTube news show called Breaking Points. And he does a really, really great job of explaining his essay. And it's a topic that I think is one of many topics that is very related to the main thesis that I introduced on my first episode of Parish and Pub, that the parish and the pub, as the two places that house the two most fundamental human activities that we can participate in, worship and leisure, should be at the center of our society. And it's the parish and the pub that actually make our culture. There are so many things, so many principles that flow from this simple thesis. And one of the things that happens when this breaks down, when there is no longer a central cultus, the breakdown of culture means the breakdown of relationships, means more isolation. And so this leads to the topic of the video today, which is the loneliness epidemic, outlined so well by Derek. And so I just want to show his description of what he's found combing through data and, pulling all this together and writing about it, and now defending and talking about his essay on this particular show. So the show starts off with one of the hosts asking Derek, can you just give us an overview of the main thesis, your main idea in this, why you wrote this essay? And this is what Derek says. Let's watch him.
Discussed.
The top line overview is that we have records going back at least the 1960s that ask Americans, how much time do you spend face-to-face socializing? How much time do you spend alone? And Americans have never, on record, spent more time alone and less time in face-to-face socializing. A lot of people are going to hear this and say, oh, this is mostly about COVID. No. Socializing declined in the back half of the 20th century between the 1960s and 1990s. Robert Putnam wrote a famous book called Bowling Alone, where he said, look, Americans are joining clubs less, they're joining associations less, they're bowling together less, they are bowling alone. A lot of people in 2000, when that book came out, said Robert Putnam is full of crap. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Americans are hanging out. They're going to hang out more than ever. But in fact, alone time just increased between 2000 and COVID. Of course, it shot up during the lockdowns. But according to one study by the Federal Reserve, we spent more time alone in 2023 than we did in 2021, the year that all those people got vaccinated, left their house, resumed life as normal. So this is a 60-year problem. This is not a pandemic issue. This is a century-long issue that was briefly accelerated by the pandemic.
Okay, so, several points there. The main one being that he introduces the essay in kind of the context of the COVID lockdowns. Obviously, in our living memory, probably the most intense isolationist time that any of us can recall. But he makes the point that this epidemic of loneliness that is continuing on is not caused by the COVID lockdowns, but was rather just only exacerbated. And actually, he makes the point that after the lockdowns were lifted, we actually saw an even higher rise in reports of isolationism. And he says that we have data going all the way back to at least the 60s, which should make you think about why that is.
This isn't just about young people. This isn't just about men or just about women. This is truly across all ages and demographics. So is the source of the problem, so to speak, the smartphone? Is that what we're dealing with here? Is just like the fallout from these things right here?
You said something so important, which is that this isn't a phenomenon about rich or poor. It's not men versus women. It's not black versus white. For literally every single demographic that the Bureau of Labor Statistics or the American Time Use Survey, which is run by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, studies, for every single demographic, face-to-face socializing declined and alone time increased. And if you want to know my answer for why this is happening, look, you can point to any number of phenomena that have happened over the last 60 years. Robert Putnam talks a lot about moral revolutions that happen in America. It's a worthy topic of conversation. I would look at 3 technologies. I think the car allowed us to privatize our lives. I think the television allowed us to privatize our leisure. And I think the smartphone allows us to privatize our attention.
Okay, I just want to pause there because, he's created a list for us. Who doesn't love a list? And he's named 3 things that are really, really interesting. There is the car, first of all, which, going back in terms of technology, the first to be introduced. The car was responsible for changing so many things about the way we live. It made it possible to travel huge distances that we could never have traveled before easily without owning at least a horse, a really expensive thing that you have to feed and take care of and scoop up its poop, and then it dies eventually. I guess cars are kind of similar. You have to feed them gas. They excrete poisonous fumes, and they do die eventually. But anyway, much more efficient than a horse. And they created the possibility of suburbs. They changed the way we build our lives geographically. So this is fascinating. Cars, that's the first thing. Then he mentions television. So what a transformative technology TV was. The attention of everyone in a room would be focused on this one thing, and no longer were people sharing a room, even if they were, like we see in scenes from Pride and Prejudice or whatever. Everyone's sitting in a room doing their own thing, reading a book or knitting, but everyone's attention could then be brought to the rest of the people. But with TV was who can resist sight, moving objects, sound in your own home where everyone can gather, and now everyone's attention is focused not on each other or not on their own thing in the company of others, with a very permeable boundary between attention and focus. The television has really changed the way that we spend our time, even together physically. And then, of course, the cell phone is just to the nth degree sucks in our attention and our focus. What an earth-shattering, seismic shift in technology in terms of how our attention is drawn and focused.
Now, even when we're in a crowd, we can be alone. And also, somewhat ironically, when we're alone, we feel like we're a part of a crowd. So I actually think that people are having a hard time recharging alone, which is one reason why they're selecting to not hang out with friends so often. But I would look at this fundamentally as a universal story that relates to universal technologies. And it's hard to think of 3 technologies more universal than cars, televisions, and smartphones. And I want to emphasize, I'm not so much saying everyone give up your car, everyone give up your television, no one watch Netflix anymore. I'm saying that we need to account for the negative externalities, the accidental side effects of our day-to-day choices.
So I really appreciate the fact that he's, saying I'm not offering a plan, a new direction for us. I'm not giving you a new game plan. I'm just saying we need to be cognizant of the fact that these things really have affected us in serious ways, in measurable ways. There are adverse effects that have been correlated to these technologies. We need to be cognizant of that.
If we choose over and over again to order food in rather than go out with friends, and we choose over and over again to watch a movie on Netflix rather than go out to dinner with friends, those choices scale over our lives, and those choices scale across the country. And that's why everybody seems to be spending more and more time by themselves.
So then, provocative question here, why is this bad? You just mentioned negative externalities. What are the negative externalities of being alone?
I do appreciate that question. I keep saying that there's, measurable data showing that there are adverse effects to all these things.
I would put it in two buckets. First off, we have a lot of really interesting research that shows that people are simply less happy when they're by themselves. Their life satisfaction is much lower, not when they spend one night alone, one night at a hotel bar, one night. I'm a father of a young child. Sometimes I think like, my God, a night alone is a blessing from God, okay? Sometimes spending some time alone is really lovely. But people who spend more time alone are by and large less happy with their lives. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I think our alone time interacts with society in some strange ways. And there used to be the saying of all politics is local. This didn't make it into the piece, but now I feel like all politics is focal. All politics is about what national news tells you to focus on, even if that story has nothing to do with your community. And I think that's a strange and alienating place for our politics to go. So I'd look at both the personal for the costs and the national.
That's a really interesting point.
You also talk about, and I'll read a quote from your piece. You say, the village is our best arena for practicing productive disagreement and compromise, in other words, democracy. So it's no surprise that the erosion of the village has coincided with the emergence of a grotesque style of politics in which every election feels like an existential quest to vanquish an intramural enemy. And you imagine two people who live in a community together who may have, polar opposite views. They're tasked with working together to collaborate on some like diversity statement for the school. And because they're forced to deal with each other face to face, they're actually able to realize like, okay, this isn't some cartoon character villain. This isn't my enemy. This is just Susie. She lives down the street. She thinks about this stuff a little different than I, but we can actually come up with something that we can all agree on. This is also why I've always thought the Union Hall was very important, because this is one of the only places where this type of politics still really occurs in America. And when you lose that, all you're left with is, this very tribal, very one-dimensional sort of existential battle that's playing out in these almost imagined spaces online.
No one, it's hard for them to think outside of the paradigm of politics when they're considering the problems of, people being isolated and lonely. But let's see how Derek responds.
It's really well said. Sometimes people ask, what's the difference between talking to someone in the real world, so-called physical world, and talking to them on your phone? Well, there's this researcher at NYU named Jay Van Bavel who looks at how exactly online conversation is different than offline conversation. And he's found that it's more extreme, it's more negative, and there's a ton more out-group hatred. So if you're at a dinner party with people who you might disagree with a little bit, you tend not to be incredibly extreme in your views or incredibly hateful of their views, or throwing the butter at them or something and telling them that their entire worldview sucks. You're drinking the same bottle of wine. You're eating the same chicken. You're passing the same salt. And so in a way, the simple need to coexist with them in a space leads to a kind of sharing of values. But we don't have anything like that on the internet, and so our conversations go berserk.
Yeah. When we interact with people in real life, the danger of having butter thrown at our face, if we take a disagreement about something to an extreme level, we dial down our rhetoric and our intensity. And we do that because we have to live with these people. We have to share a space, and you can see them more for who they are, as opposed to seeing them as disembodied speech bubbles, just full of stuff that you disagree with at some level. No, these are people. Let's keep going.
I think this show does a wonderful job of talking to people that you disagree with and that you agree with, and modeling how to have conversations with people that you disagree with in a way that doesn't simply hate on them for the fact of their disagreement. You disagree? Okay, we're people. We disagree about stuff. That's what living in a democracy is. Now let's have a conversation. As you both know, you're active on social media. It's very difficult to have those conversations on Twitter because it's so easy to just quote tweet something that Crystal says and say, oh, let me take this out of context and show you how absolutely absurd this point of view is. Harder to do that at a dinner table. Harder to do that in any kind of conversation because the other person can respond and say, I share your values, but I disagree. So I do think the migration of our political conversations from the physical world, where all politics is local, to the digital world, where all politics is focal, absolutely changes the nature of our politics.
I totally agree with you, Derek. So in it, you note a few actually good trends. Independent bookstores are booming. Board game cafes are becoming a thing. But, it's a Band-Aid, I think, to a much bigger problem. What are some solutions? Is it just to be aware of the problem? Is it to actively seek things out? What are researchers looking at for activities that seem to at least address these negative externalities?
What I would say in the big picture is that science and technology tend to move linearly, and culture moves in a cycle.
Yeah.
So medicine tends to just get better and better and better, and computers just tend to get faster and faster and faster. That's a story that exists along a line. Culture tends to go back and forth and back and forth. What's the style of jeans these days? Skinny,
from the
roomy,
90s.
skinny, roomy? Who knows?
Right.
Culture can change. It does change. That's what makes it culture. In the first half of the 20th.
So I'll just short point here. He's saying culture, and I think he means fashion. I think a culture can endure while fashions can be cyclical or temporal or come and go. Let's hear where he's going with this.
20th century, we had an enormously social century. Union rates were up, marriage went up, fertility went up, the number of people who joined all kinds of associations went up. There was a kind of moral revolution in togetherness. And it changed the 1960s and 1970s for a variety of reasons, including perhaps just the rise of a certain kind of American individualism or the resurgence of a certain kind of American individualism. But culture can change. And one thing that I want to do with this piece is just to hold up a mirror to America and say, this is what we've done to ourselves.
Okay, he's right. Culture can change. Culture can change and evolve. I guess when you're talking about sort of decades, that's the cyclical length of fashions. But culture can change over the course of half centuries and centuries. I think this is something that has been creeping along, and maybe was sped up in the 60s, late 50s, early 60s, post World War II. And I think this is a longer trend to isolationism, partly because of Charles Taylor, his magnum opus, his monograph, The Secular Age, where he describes the buffered self replacing the porous self, and people. I think that's really the beginning of the problem of isolationism, where people stopped being open to the transcendent, open to the world, open not only to the transcendent, but also to what naturally follows from that is being less open and porous to those around you. And the more the technologies start helping you to realize that idea, i.e. the privatization of travel, of leisure, of attention via car, TV, and smartphone, I think this goes way, way beyond the 60s.
A handful of decisions that bit by bit, one night at home, have collectively created a world where everybody is spending a record amount of time alone. Do you want that? Do you like the reflection in the mirror? And I'm hoping that people say, no, I don't. And so they become a little more likely to hang out on Thursday. And that makes their friends a little more likely to invite them out the next Thursday for dinner. And that makes the friend of the friend a little bit more likely to start a book club because they see more people leaving their house, right? Uh-huh. Little actions create norms, and norms cascading create behaviors, and behaviors cascading create movements. And my hope is that the piece is the beginning of just that.
Yeah. And
that's great. Yeah, small changes. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing here. I'm just trying to add a voice to this, but I love the idea of small changes, incremental steps to addressing this. I think we can reverse this trend. That's what I hope.
Derek, I have one more question for you on the political piece, because I thought this was an interesting insight and different than what the post-Trump reelect conversation has been. You describe Trump's style.
Okay, so again, this is a politics show, and everything has to be brought back to politics, and this is This is a cultural thing. This is above politics. So let's see where this question goes, and let's see how he answers.
Style as a triumph of this all-tribe, no-village form of confrontation politics. A lot of the Democratic lessons have been more like, and maybe this is like, a positive direction to go in, but not really responsive to the moment we live in, has been more like, we need to do more outreach. We need to be nicer to people that disagree. When actually, Trump isn't nice to people who disagree with him. He calls them the enemy. He says he's going to, sick the national security state on, send out the military against them. He uses every name in the book to describe his enemies. And we're not just talking about elites. We're talking about anyone who disagrees with him and his movement. And you say, actually, that form of politics was very successful enough to put him back in the White House, successful enough to really sort of touch on the moment culturally that we're living in. So, what does that mean for Democrats in terms of how they should respond to this moment?
Look, it's a really good question, and I don't have the answer. Not every story is the same story, right? I wrote this 8,000, 9,000 word piece about the phenomenon that Americans spend an historic amount of time alone, and that I think it's making them sadder individually and our society sicker because of it. I don't want to represent this article as being a kind of Rosetta Stone for the future of Democratic Party politics or Democratic Party messaging. Mm-hmm. It might be the case that a meaner style of politics in the 2020s, and maybe even going forward in the age of the internet, might be more successful because people spend more time alone. And if my job were to be a political consultant, I would say, meet people where they are. They're alone. They're angry. They're spending all of their time on the internet where they feel extreme and an enormous amount of outgroup animosity. Meet them where they are and feed that outgroup animosity. That might be a totally reasonable strategy for winning that election. But there's a lovely concept of the difference between infinite and finite games. And finite games are made to be won, and infinite games are made to keep playing. An election is a finite game. One side wins and one side loses. But life is a kind of infinite game. You want to keep living. You want to keep winning. And it's conceivable that the best strategies for being happy in the world might not be the best strategies for how to win political contests in the next midterm. Not every story is the same story. And so you want to be sure you know what question you're asking. Is the question how to win in rural Pennsylvania? Or is the question how to live the happiest life in the next few years, right? This piece is focused squarely on this.
Yes. Thank you. He can distinguish between the two things, how to maneuver yourself politically for short-term gain versus how to address your aunt and uncle and neighbors. This is what he's trying to tell us, his friends, his neighbors. We are all in this together. We've all been affected, regardless of what side of the political spectrum we may find ourselves on. We are all suffering from the same societal ills and problems, and we're all catching the same diseases. So, the answers to the diseases have to be as universal as the problem. You can't politicize this and fix the problem. You can politicize it and be political. You can't politicize it and fix this problem. So, that's it's a good interview, and I really appreciate a voice like this. So the more voices like this can be heard, the better. I'm all about it, and I'm here for it. I am going to boost the signal, as it were. So anyway, let me know what you think about what he said, about my response to it. If you have any other thoughts or responses to these ideas. In the meantime, though, go to church, go to your pub, and that's a start. Small things. It would behoove us all to examine our own lives and see if there's a way that we can be less isolationist on purpose, and in fixing those things become more happy on accident. This has been Parrish and Bob. See you next time.